The name Ypres was not famous before the First World War. It was just a small medieval town in Belgium, surrounded by flat farmland and cobblestone roads. But by the war's end, it had become something else entirely, a graveyard for nations. The first shells fell in October 1914, during what soldiers would call the First Battle of Ypres. The fields turned to mud almost instantly, swallowing horses, guns, and men. Thousands fought to hold the narrow strip of land known as the Ypres salient, a bulge in the Allied line that refused to collapse under the German assault. In April 1915, the second battle brought something new to warfare, a horror the world had never seen. Greenish-yellow clouds drifted toward the trenches. Men coughed, choked, and clawed at their throats as chlorine gas swept through the lines. It marked the dawn of chemical warfare, and Ypres would never be the same again. Then came 1917, the third battle. Passchendaele turned the land into a swamp of blood and rain. Soldiers advanced through waist-deep mud, rifles clogged, boots torn away by the suction of the earth. Gains were measured not in miles, but in yards, and every yard was paid for in lives. By the time the guns fell silent, Ypres had been shelled to rubble, its fields permanently scarred, its name forever bound to the worst horrors of modern war. Ypres was not one battle. It was 3 acts of the same tragedy, each one darker than the last. In 1914, Ypres was not a place you would expect to become a symbol of industrial slaughter. It was a small, ancient market town in the Flanders region of Belgium, famous for its medieval cloth hall and the steady trade of wool and textiles. Narrow streets wound between stone houses. Farmers tended their crops in the flat fields beyond the town walls. It was quiet, self-contained, and far removed from the military tensions brewing in the capitals of Europe. Belgium itself was neutral by treaty, a status guaranteed by Britain, France, and Germany alike. This neutrality was not a courtesy, it was a strategic necessity for the balance of power in Europe. For decades, the small kingdom had lived under this umbrella, confident that its independence would be respected. But in the summer of 1914, as alliances snapped into place and armies began to mobilize, the treaty that had once protected Belgium would become the very reason it was invaded. Germany's military planners had long feared a war on 2 fronts. France in the west, Russia in the east. The solution was the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy to defeat France quickly before turning to face Russia. It demanded speed, surprise, and a ruthless disregard for Belgium's neutrality. The German army would swing through Belgium like a gate, bypassing the heavy French fortifications along their mutual border, and strike at Paris from the north. On August 2, 1914, Germany delivered an ultimatum to Belgium: allow passage of German troops or face invasion. King Albert I refused, declaring that a nation's honor was worth defending, even against overwhelming odds. 2 days later, German troops crossed the border. The invasion was swift and brutal. Towns were shelled without warning. Civilians were shot in reprisals for acts of resistance, sometimes for nothing at all. In the ancient university city of Leuven, the Germans burned the library, destroying centuries of manuscripts and books, an act that shocked the world and was condemned as a crime against culture. The Belgian army, though outnumbered and outgunned, resisted fiercely, slowing the German advance and buying precious time. Britain, bound by treaty, declared war on Germany. The British Expeditionary Force, a small, professional army, crossed the Channel to join the fight. The French moved north to support their new allies. By October 1914, the war had already shifted from quick maneuvers to a grinding contest of endurance. The race to the sea, an attempt by each side to outflank the other, had ended with both armies entrenched from Switzerland to the North Sea. Ypres sat at a crucial junction in this new front. Whoever held it controlled the routes to the channel ports of Calais and Dunkirk, vital lifelines for the British Army. The stage was set. In the weeks to come, Ypres would transform from a quiet Flemish town into a battlefield that would be fought over again and again. Its name etched into the history of the Great War as one of the most dangerous and fiercely contested places on Earth. When the British Expeditionary Force arrived in France in August 1914, its officers were under no illusions about their role. They were not the main army that was the French. The BEF was a precision instrument, small, highly trained, and experienced from years of colonial campaigning. Their job was to act as a rapid response force, holding key positions while the French took the brunt of the fight. After the battles of Mons and Le Cateau, the BEF had fallen back in good order, avoiding destruction while inflicting serious losses on the advancing Germans. By September, the Allies had checked the German offensive on the Marne, forcing a retreat to the Aisne. But the war was already shifting. Neither side could break through the other's entrenched lines, and so began the race to the sea, an extended series of maneuvers northward, each side trying to turn the other's flank and reach the Channel coast. The movement was not a sprint, but a grinding chess match. Cavalry units probed for weak spots. Infantry advanced along railway lines and farm tracks. Each time one side seemed to be outflanking the other, the gap was filled with fresh troops and more trenches. The ground was becoming an unbroken scar of earthworks, barbed wire, and hastily dug strongpoints. By mid-October, the northern anchor of the Allied line rested on Ypres. The town's location made it vital. It sat on a low rise surrounded by flat plains, with roads radiating toward the coast and into German-held territory. For the Germans, capturing Ypres meant a clear path to the ports of Calais and Dunkirk. For the Allies, losing it would mean risking their supply lines across the Channel and perhaps the survival of the BEF itself. The terrain around Ypres was deceptive. The ridges were barely more than gentle slopes, but in a flat country, even a few meters of elevation mattered. Whoever held the high ground could see for miles, direct artillery with deadly accuracy, and make any advance across open fields suicidal. The area was also cut with drainage ditches and streams, which, once damaged by shell fire, would turn fields into quagmires. When the BEF took positions around Ypres, they formed a bulge in the Allied line, what would come to be known as the Ypres salient. A salient is a dangerous place to defend. It can be attacked from three sides, and withdrawal often means heavy losses. But the British had little choice. Giving it up meant giving up Ypres, and Ypres could not be lost. In late October 1914, German forces began probing attacks against the salient. These were not yet the mass assaults to come, but they tested the British defenses and sought to exploit any weak spots. French territorial divisions and Belgian units held sections of the line, often in poor condition after weeks of retreat and battle. The British regulars filled the gaps, moving from sector to sector as needed. Their numbers stretched dangerously thin. By the final week of October, it was clear the Germans were preparing for a major offensive. Trainloads of troops and artillery were arriving behind their lines. The sound of movement in the night wagons, hooves, shouted orders carried across the still air. The defenders in the salient, many of them exhausted from weeks without rest, could feel the tension mounting. The first Battle of Ypres was about to begin, and with it, the name of this small Flemish town would enter history. On the morning of October 19, 1914, the quiet of the Flanders countryside shattered. The German 4th and 6th Armies, reinforced by fresh reserves from the east, launched their assault on the Ypres salient. Their goal was simple: break through the British and French lines, take Ypres, and roll down to the Channel ports before winter could set in. The first blows fell against the northern and eastern flanks of the salient. Mist clung to the low fields, masking the movement of German infantry until they were dangerously close. Then the fog lifted, and the defenders saw them long lines of gray-coated troops advancing with rifles at the shoulder, supported by the booming rhythm of heavy artillery. The ground shook under the barrage. Earth and timber erupted from the trenches, showering the men inside with mud and debris. British regulars, veterans of Empire, worked their bolt-action Lee Enfields with mechanical precision. A well-trained rifleman could fire 15 aimed shots in a minute, and the massed fire cut swaths through the German ranks before they reached the wire. But the enemy kept coming, stepping over the fallen, their own officers shouting them forward. The French held the southern shoulder of the salient, their lines bolstered by colonial troops from North Africa. Wearing khaki-brown greatcoats and turbans dusted with mud, these men fought with fierce determination despite the cold and wet, firing from behind shattered farm walls and hedgerows. As the day wore on, the battle spread across the entire salient. German artillery pounded Ypres itself, smashing its medieval buildings and sending civilians fleeing westward in carts piled high with whatever they could carry. The Cloth Hall, a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, took its first scars from shellfire. The town was no longer just a military objective, it was becoming part of the battlefield. At the Menin Road, east of Ypres, British infantry held their positions against repeated German attacks. Machine guns, scarce but vital, scythed down advancing troops. Yet every success came at a cost. Casualties mounted in the muddy forward trenches, where stretcher-bearers risked their lives to carry the wounded back through shell-torn ground. By nightfall, neither side had achieved a breakthrough. The Germans had gained a few hundred yards in some places, but the salient still held. For the men in the line, the first day was a grim introduction to what the battle would become. A fight of endurance, fought in choking smoke, broken earth, and the constant roar of the guns. And this was only the beginning. The pressure was about to intensify, and the defenders would soon find themselves outnumbered and surrounded on three sides, with no relief in sight. By late October 1914, the First Battle of Ypres had become a contest of sheer survival. The British Expeditionary Force, already worn down by weeks of retreat and battle, now faced repeated German attacks from three sides. Many of these soldiers were the last of Britain's pre-war professional army, the so-called Old Contemptibles, a title they embraced after the German Kaiser allegedly referred to them with contempt. These men were experts in musketry, discipline, and holding a line under impossible pressure, but the numbers were against them. In some sectors, a single battalion was asked to defend ground that should have been held by a brigade. Artillery shells fell in ceaseless arcs, turning the soft Flemish soil into a landscape of craters and churned mud. One of the fiercest struggles took place near Gellerveld, a small village that became a key point in the German advance. On October 31st, the Germans broke through the British line here, threatening to collapse the entire salient. At that moment, the 2nd Battalion of the Worcestershire Regiment counterattacked without hesitation. Charging through shell fire, they retook the village and sealed the breach, preventing a complete disaster. Elsewhere, the French and Belgian forces fought to hold the southern and northern shoulders of the salient. Belgian troops, battered and exhausted from earlier battles along the Ypres, held their ground despite the threat of being cut off. French colonial units stood firm in the south, countering repeated assaults with determined rifle fire and bayonet charges. The human cost was staggering. Entire companies were reduced to a handful of survivors. Junior officers, barely out of school, found themselves in command of battle-weary veterans. Wounded men were treated in makeshift aid stations, sometimes in farmhouses still under shelling. By early November, the weather turned colder, with rain making every trench a waterlogged trap. Yet the Germans kept pressing forward, determined to take Ypres before winter. It was only when the exhausted attackers began to run short of men and ammunition that the pressure eased. The First Battle of Ypres came to a close in late November 1914. The Allies had held the town, but at an immense cost. The BEF was effectively destroyed as a professional force. Most of the pre-war soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. Britain would now have to rely on its growing army of volunteers, the New Army, to fill the ranks. Ypres itself was scarred but still standing, the medieval heart of the town battered yet intact enough to serve as a rallying point for soldiers and a symbol of resistance. But no one in the salient doubted that the Germans would return. The ground they had fought so hard to keep was now a killing zone, and the war was far from over. The winter of 1915 settled over the Ypres salient like a damp, suffocating blanket. The front lines froze in place, but there was no peace in this lull. Both sides dug in deeper, reinforcing trenches, building dugouts, and stringing miles of barbed wire across the open ground. The muddy fields of Flanders became a permanent front, defined by its misery as much as by its danger. For the soldiers, daily life was a constant struggle against the elements. Trenches were knee-deep in water, and the chalky Flemish soil offered little drainage. Frostbite took toes and fingers. Trench foot rotted flesh before the eyes of field medics. Rats thrived in the stagnant water and fed on unburied dead caught between the lines. Still, the Ypres salient was no quiet posting. Every day brought shelling, sniper fire, and trench raids, small, violent clashes meant to gather intelligence or keep the enemy off balance. The Germans in particular began experimenting with new weapons here, improved trench mortars, rifle grenades, and more precise artillery spotting from observation balloons. By early 1915, the Germans recognized that a straightforward infantry assault on the salient would be costly and might fail as it had in the First Battle of Ypres. Instead, they began planning a more unorthodox attack, one that would break the deadlock without requiring overwhelming manpower. German scientists and military planners had been experimenting with chlorine gas, a chemical weapon capable of killing or incapacitating large numbers of troops in minutes. The Ypres salient, with its exposed Allied positions and prevailing winds, was seen as the ideal place to test this on a large scale. Meanwhile, the Allies were stretched thin. British forces in the salient were still recovering from the devastating losses of 1914, their ranks filled with inexperienced recruits who had never faced a major attack. French and Canadian troops manned large sections of the line, the Canadians eager to prove themselves in their first major action of the war. To the west, Ypres itself had become a battered hub of military activity. Supply columns rattled through its ruined streets, bringing food, ammunition, and reinforcements forward, while ambulances carried the wounded back. The once beautiful cloth hall was now a gutted shell, standing over the town like a ghost of the old world. By April 1915, the stage was set. German forces had concentrated along the north of the salient, opposite French colonial troops, holding the line near Langemarck. The attack that was coming would be unlike anything the Western Front had seen, a new form of warfare that would change the very nature of battle. On the evening of April 22, 1915, a strange stillness settled over the northern edge of the Ypres salient. The wind, which for days had blown fitfully, now came steady from the northeast, directly from the German lines toward the French and Canadian positions. The men in the trenches noticed unusual activity across no man's land, the shifting of heavy cylinders, the clinking of metal fittings, and the occasional hiss of valves. At precisely 5 p.m., the German artillery opened with a thunderous bombardment. Shells screamed overhead, churning up earth and splintering what little cover remained. But then, as abruptly as it had begun, the barrage ceased. In its place came an eerie greenish-yellow cloud, rolling low along the ground, driven by the steady wind. At first, some soldiers thought it was merely smoke from shelling, but as the cloud enveloped the forward trenches, the truth became horrifically clear. Men began choking and clawing at their throats, their eyes burning as if from fire. Chlorine gas was heavier than air. It sank into the dugouts and shell holes, pooling where men sought shelter. It stripped the lungs of their protective lining, turning every breath into agony. Panic swept through the French colonial troops on the northern flank, many of them Algerians who had never experienced anything like this. Within minutes, Their line collapsed under the twin assault of gas and German infantry advancing behind it. The gap they left was massive, 4 miles wide, a hole in the Allied defenses that could have allowed the Germans to roll up the salient entirely. In the chaos, Canadian forces in reserve reacted with remarkable speed. Using improvised methods, soaking cloth in water or urine and pressing it over their mouths, they moved forward to plug the breach. Fighting in clouds of lingering gas, they held off repeated German attacks throughout the night, often reduced to hand-to-hand combat in the thickening dusk. For the men caught in the gas, there was no forgetting its effects. Survivors described their skin tingling and blistering, their lungs burning with every breath, and a constant taste of metal in the mouth. The ground where the gas had passed was littered with bodies, some twisted in unnatural shapes, others lying face down in the mud, as if asleep. The attack had been a tactical success for the Germans, but it fell short of its full potential. Cautious about moving too far into untested territory, and perhaps unprepared for the scale of the gap they had created, German commanders failed to exploit the breakthrough completely. This hesitation allowed the Allies to regroup and stabilize the line, though at a terrible cost. The Second Battle of Ypres raged on for weeks, with the Germans launching further gas attacks and the Allies responding with desperate counterattacks. The salient shrank under the pressure, but it did not break. Ypres remained in Allied hands, though now its defenders knew the war had changed forever. The introduction of chemical weapons had opened a new chapter in warfare, one that no nation could now close. The gas clouds of April 22nd had forever marked the Ypres salient. The men who remained were not just fighting an enemy they could see, but one they could feel in their lungs and taste in the air long after the wind had carried it away. Chlorine had stained the battlefield with a new kind of fear, one that could not be fought with rifle or bayonet. Yet despite the panic and the horrifying casualties, the salient did not collapse. Canadian troops, standing shoulder to shoulder with British reinforcements and fragments of the retreating French colonial units, anchored a defensive line along the gaps the gas had torn open. They fought in choking air, in fields where every shell hole might still hold the green haze of death, and they did it without faltering. The Germans pressed hard in the days that followed. On April the 24th, they launched another gas attack, this time directly against the Canadian positions at Saint-Julien. The wind once again carried the poison into the trenches, and once again, improvised measures, wet rags, torn shirts soaked in whatever liquid was at hand, were all the soldiers had. Men fought half-blinded, coughing between bursts of rifle fire, refusing to abandon their posts, even as comrades collapsed beside them. Casualties mounted at a staggering rate. Field ambulances overflowed, their drivers navigating shattered roads under constant shell fire. In dressing stations, doctors and nurses struggled to treat the gas victims, washing their eyes and lungs as best they could. But for many, it was too late. The injured gas survivors who lived carried the effects for life-scarred lungs, weakened bodies, and memories of the suffocating green cloud that no one could race. The fight for Saint-Julien became a bitter contest of yards. Canadian counterattacks pushed the Germans back in some places, only for new waves to force the defenders into fresh positions. The land itself changed once green fields were now churned mud and cratered ground, littered with the detritus of war. Twisted rifles, shredded packs, and the dark outlines where men had fallen. By late May 1915, the Second Battle of Ypres burned itself out. The Germans had shortened the salient, taking high ground that gave them a better view and better artillery targeting into the Allied positions. But they had not taken Ypres. The Allies had absorbed the first major chemical weapon attack in history and held the line. The cost was terrible. The Canadians suffered nearly 6,000 casualties, the French colonial troops even more. British losses mounted as they reinforced the line under constant shelling. Civilians who had not already fled now left for good, their homes reduced to rubble. In the months that followed, Gas masks became standard issue for soldiers across the front, crude at first but improving quickly. The horror of Ypres had forced every army to adapt and to accept that the war had entered a darker, more inhuman phase. The salient remained a place of death, and all knew that as long as Ypres stood in Allied hands, the Germans would try again. By the summer of 1917, Ypres had become more than a town. It was a symbol to the Allies of resistance, to the Germans of a thorn that had to be pulled out at any cost. The salient was still there, jutting like a stubborn wedge into the German line. And in July, the British High Command decided to try and drive the Germans from the high ground east of Ypres, once and for all. The plan was ambitious. A massive artillery bombardment followed by a steady advance across the ridges toward the village of Passchendaele. The goal was not only to capture the high ground, but to threaten the German submarine bases along the Belgian coast. The commanders hoped that with enough guns, they could smash the enemy's defenses before infantry even moved forward. For 2 weeks, the British guns roared almost without pause. Entire landscapes were flattened, and German trenches became indistinct scars beneath the shell fire. But the bombardment had an unintended consequence. The heavy shells shattered the drainage systems of the already waterlogged Flanders plain. When the summer rains came, and they came hard, the ground dissolved into a quagmire. On July 31st, the infantry attack began. British, Australian, New Zealand, and Canadian troops climbed from their trenches and began the slow push forward. Progress was measured in yards, each one fought over with rifles, machine guns, and grenades. The mud swallowed boots, rifles, and sometimes men entirely. Wounded soldiers who could not be reached quickly were in danger of drowning in shell holes filled with rainwater. The German defense was tenacious. Using concrete pillboxes and deep dugouts, they absorbed the bombardment, then emerged to sweep the open ground with machine gun fire. Every advance came at a staggering price, yet the British kept going, driven by the belief that one more push could break the German hold on the ridges. In October, the Canadians were brought in to take the final objective, the shattered village of Passchendaele itself. The approach was across a moonscape of mud and debris, under constant shelling and in freezing rain. Every step forward was an act of will. A soldier might spend an entire day crawling from one shell hole to the next, moving just a few dozen yards. On November 6, 1917, after months of attrition, the Canadians finally took Passchendaele. The village was nothing but ruins, barely recognizable as a place where people had once lived. The cost was beyond belief. The Allies had gained less than 5 miles of ground at the price of over 250,000 casualties. The Germans had suffered nearly as many. When the guns finally fell silent, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Fields had become lakes of mud. Roads had vanished. Horses lay half submerged in waterlogged craters. The air reeked of decay. And for all suffering, the strategic gains were minimal. The village of Passchendaele would be abandoned by the Allies less than a year later in the German spring offensive. For the men who fought there, Passchendaele was more than a battle. It was a test of how much misery a human being could endure, and for many, it proved that even survival could feel like a hollow victory. By 1918, Ypres had endured 4 years of near-constant bombardment. Its name had become a byword for suffering. The town itself was gone, reduced to rubble and skeletal walls. The surrounding countryside was a scarred wasteland, stripped of trees, homes, and farmland. Only the jagged remains of church towers and the shattered stone of the cloth hall hinted that life had ever existed here. The end came in stages. In the spring of 1918, the Germans launched their massive spring offensive, a desperate attempt to win the war before American forces could arrive in full strength. The Ypres sector came under renewed attack, and some ground gained at such terrible cost in earlier battles was lost again in days. For a time, it seemed as if the sacrifices of 1914, 1915, and 1917 had been for nothing. But in August, the tide turned. The Allies counterattacked on multiple fronts, launching what would become known as the 100 Days Offensive. Canadian, British, and Belgian troops pushed steadily eastward. By late September, the Germans were falling back along the entire Western Front. In the Ypres salient, the Allies reclaimed ground with surprising speed, but this time the advance was not marked by months of bombardment. The German army was too exhausted to hold. On October 14, 1918, Belgian forces recaptured Passchendaele, the same village that had cost so much blood the year before. 2 weeks later, Ypres itself was free of enemy artillery range for the first time since 1914. The guns fell silent less than a month later with the armistice on November 11th. But the silence was deceptive. The fields around Ypres were littered with unexploded shells, rusting barbed wire, and the remains of tens of thousands of men whose bodies had never been recovered. Farmers would spend decades plowing up fragments of the war helmets, rifles, and bones. Even today, more than a century later, the so-called Iron Harvest continues, with unexploded munitions found every year. The human cost was almost beyond comprehension. Across the three great battles of Ypres, the combined casualties killed, wounded, missing numbered in the hundreds of thousands for both sides. Some units were almost completely annihilated. Entire streets in Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand lost most of their young men here. And yet, Ypres became a place of memory as much as tragedy. The Menin Gate Memorial, unveiled in 1927, now bears the names of more than 54,000 Commonwealth soldiers who have no known grave. Each evening, the last post is sounded there, echoing through the archways as a reminder of those who never returned. For those who fought, Ypres was not just a battle. It was a crucible, a place that tested the limits of courage, endurance, and human survival. And for the generations that followed, it became a warning that there are places in the world where victory and loss are measured not in territory gained, but in the sheer cost of holding on.